Well, welcome to another Relate Well Live with Dr. Rick Marks. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to move this over just a little bit here. And I'm learning, I'm in the process of learning. I'm in the process of learning some things on how to do this well. And of course, me move this down out of my head here a little bit. So, for those that have kind of hung with me for the past week or so, please forgive and overlook the cough. It's my COVID cough. I had COVID for about 3.5 weeks. I was down for quite a bit. And my wife had it, and my son and daughter-in-law had it. We all kind of shared it at the same time. And I've got the residue of the COVID cough left over. So if you will forgive me for that and overlook the coughs, I've got some trusty water right here to help me as well. But these are informal. Hopefully that you will find these Relate Well Live videos of value to you as you think about your own personal life, how you live your life, and how you live your life in relationship. Because everything we do is in relationships, whether we like it or not. You have relationships with the gas people. You have relationships with the checkout people at Walmart. If you go there enough, you have relationships with your family, you have relationship with friends, you have relationship with coworkers. Everything we do is relationship. And when you learn to relate well, then you will have healthy relationships as far as it concerns you. If you don't learn to relate well, you won't have healthy relationships. That's just real simple. Life is not difficult. My favorite quote is by Einstein. Einstein said, "Make things simple, but not simpler." People think complexity is a very wonderful thing. Actually, complexity, what is it? Einstein said also, he said, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it. Somehow we value complexity because complexity makes you sound like you're brilliant. Well, the reality is you're not really helping anybody because they don't follow your complexity. And if it's too complex, you probably don't understand it anyways. And so I like simple. I always tell people I'm a closet redneck from North Georgia. Simple is good for me. But there's a lot of profoundness in being simple because the brain works better when things are just simple. It creates understanding, and understanding is a powerful way to live life, because then you go, I get it. And I kind of realize this as well, be it as a life coach or as a minister or a psychologist. If I teach something and you go, I've kind of known that all along. You want to know something? I did a good job, because I believe a really good teacher teaches you something that's actually already, that knowledge is in you. You weren't aware of it. You didn't know how to clarify it. You didn't know how to say it, but they bring it out of you and you go, that makes sense. I kind of sensed that, but wasn't sure how to put language to it. That's a good teacher. That's a good teacher. They're able to bring things out of you, to bring to your awareness, into your life experience. And you go, I kind of knew that. My hope is that today's talk on emotional triggers, what I call trigger troubles, I hope that maybe in such a small way that will happen for you. All right, so we're talking about emotional triggers, what I call trigger troubles in marriage. Now, let's be honest, these apply in any relationship, all right? Now, they apply to all humans. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now, what does it I mean by triggers, and where do these triggers come from? Well, let's talk about what I mean by a trigger. A trigger is an intense and emotional reaction. All right. It's when you get emotionally triggered, that emotional trigger that you have because of something that happened. The best definition I've seen came from Dr. Lori Gordon, that it's an intense emotional reaction. So it comes from the center of the brain, and the emotional part of the brain known as the limbic system, and that's also linked to what's called the brainstem and what I refer to as the lower order brain, which is where the fight, flight, or freeze response comes from. So it's an intense reaction to an event. In other words, something happens out here in life, right? You see something, or you smell something, or you hear something. And whenever you experience some event, something that happened, all right, when you have that event takes place, your brain sees it. And at 1/2,000th of a second, you have an emotional reaction. Now, Dr. Lori Gordon called that an emotional allergy. Other therapists have different names for it. All right. Everyone knows it happens. So the emotional trigger is an intense emotional reaction to an event, to something that happened, to an event, or to something that you saw or smell, right? It didn't have to be something here. It could just be a song. It could be a smell. It's an intense emotional reaction to an event or some stimuli that is in the present. That is in the present. But is linked to something in the past or past belief systems. We'll talk about that in a little bit, all right? So the trigger is an intense emotional reaction to something that happens or some stimuli that is in the present. The trigger is in the present, but the reaction is actually a reaction because your brain is interpreting the thing that happened in the present. It's linked to something in your past. It's linked to something in your past, something that happened to you. Now, why does the brain react this way? Why does the brain react to issues or stimuli in the present with this intense fight, flight, or freeze response? The answer is simple. Survival. Survival. You see, the brain is wired to do one thing really, really well for you. The brain is wired for you to survive. It's all really care. I mean, it'll make sure your blood's, your heart's pumping and blood, and that you're breathing. It does all those things. Right? This lower part of the brain back here, it runs all those autonomic bodily functions for you. But the brain has a one overarching responsibility for the human. Is to make sure you survive. As a matter of fact, all mammals have this part of a brain. All mammals have a fight, flight, or freeze response. All of them. I remember when I was young, we cornered a possum. Me and my brother had been doing some things, and we needed to catch it, and we caught it. And we trapped it in a cage. Well, when we came towards that cage, that possum went to the back end of the cage and just started releasing its bowels. It couldn't control it. It just released its bowels. You go, why? It's the flight response. The brain of that possum saw this threat as kids coming up towards it, and it couldn't go anywhere. And that's the flight response. The brain was getting the body ready of all excess weight so that it could run. The problem is when it was in a cage and couldn't. You'll see this same response a lot of times in combat. A lot of guys know in the military that before you go into a combat zone, get rid of go take a dump. Just go use the bathroom. Why? Because a lot of guys in combat, when something happens, they'll mess in their pants. Why? It's the flight response of the brain. It's the brain getting rid of all excess material so they can do the one thing it needs to do, run to survive. That's normal. And so our brain is wired for survival. And the fight, flight, and freeze response of the brain is a survival mechanism. If your brain doesn't have the ability to think at this level, it just reacts. It just reacts. The flight response is when your brain basically says, look, I've got to run from this threat. It's a stress response. You're feeling threatened by this thing out here. And so your brain says, run, get away from it. I grew up in a home where I was always put down by my stepmother, never ever affirmed or approved or accepted by her. And my dad was on some level, but he also had his anger problem. And, he bought a cow prod when I was 10 or 11, he used to shock us. And though he had his good side, he had his dark side. But one thing that my brain learned to do really early in life was run, just to run. And so I really developed the flight response really well. When conflict would show up in a relationship, I'd shut down and pull away. When the flight response happens in human relationships, a lot of times you'll see something like this. It'll look like if you're in the flight response, like, And then you hear things like this. My wife's name, Luella. All right, Luella, fine, whatever. You know what? Just do it your way. I don't really care. I didn't really matter to me. In the relationship, your brain feels a threat. And so a lot of times when you see that kind of behavior, that's the flight response. Your brain saying, get away. Your brain also does what's called a fight response. Now, the fight response, you get adrenaline just like you do in the flight response. In the flight response, you get adrenaline to run. In the fight response, you get adrenaline to attack. Because I'm feeling threatened by you, but I don't want to feel threatened by you. You're a threat to me. So the posture of a fight response is basically this. A good defense, hang with me just a minute, please. The posture there is a good defense is the posture of my Instagram thing went off, so I had to go back and change it. I think I forgot to hit don't turn off. And so I'm learning this stuff, folks. I'm really green at this. Can you tell? All right. The fight response is when the brain says, look, I feel threatened by you. So the posture of the fight response is this. A good defense is a good offense. I'll squash you before you can squash me. You see, now after you squash that person, because when you're in a fight response, man, you're argumentative, you're loud, you're condescending, you attack, you criticize, right? You never take responsibility. It can look like this, shut up. Who do you think you are? You're just like your mother. You don't know what you're talking about. And a lot of times when you're in the fight response, if you're sitting down, you're going to stand up. Why? Because the adrenaline's going to push your body up. Why? Because it's about power. And usually you see something like this, who do you think you are? You're just like your mother. Don't talk to me that way. Because what's the brain doing? The brain is trying to squash the other person so that the brain won't feel threatened by that person. Now, once you squash that person, you will feel safe. Remember, this part of the brain is all about safety. But though you feel safe, you've just damaged two things. You've damaged the relationship and your partner. But that's all right. I feel safe. It's very destructive. And then the third response of the brain is called the freeze response. This is when fight and flight isn't working and your brain feels so threatened, your brain just shuts down. Here, people move into depression. People become stoic, distant, cold. You communicate like a super reasonable computer. What you're saying here is, I'm not going to deal with your emotions and I ain't dealing with mine. And because I'm not dealing with yours or mine, all we'll do is talk about the facts or we just won't talk at all. And when a person's in a freeze response, they are shut down emotionally. It's a brain self-protective mechanism. When fight and flight doesn't work, you just freeze. Problem is, whenever you try and communicate or solve problems from this lower order animal brain, fight, fright, or freeze part, you'll never solve problems. You never deal with conflict well. You'll never, ever be able to communicate and build intimacy. Why? Because this part of the brain doesn't think of relationships. This part of the brain is purely about survival. This part of the brain is purely about what I need to do to survive and be healthy. And that means if I have to squash you, I will. If I have to run from you, I will. Or if I have to shut down with you, I will. But we're not going to have a relationship. Now, all brains do this, by the way, and you want this part of your brain working. This is the part of the brain you want working if an 18-wheeler is about to come across the interstate at you at 90 miles an hour. You don't want to think about that, you see. To use the higher order brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, to use that part of your brain to think about the threat could get you killed, because the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex here, this part of your brain is the slowest part of the brain. This one back here, hyper fast. Why? It's reactive. You want this part of your brain working. And so triggers are those emotional reactions that we get. All right? Those emotional reactions of fight, flight, or freeze that come from something that happening in the present. Example. A long time ago, I was at a Walmart in the checkout lane, and I noticed the lady in front of me wasn't doing well. She was shaking. And I noticed, and she was trying to get her breath together. And I said, ma'am, excuse me. She looked at me startled. And I said, I noticed that you're struggling. I don't know what it is, but I do want you to know I care. I told her my background as a minister and a counselor. And I said, is there anything I could help with? And she said, I don't know. She said, this just came over me. I said, what did? She goes, this feeling. I said, just now? Yeah, like within the last minute. So I began to help her process what had just happened. And here it was. We figured it out. A man had walked by us, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds before. Just walked by us. He was wearing a cologne. It was Old Spice. It was Old Spice. That's all it was. So he walked by us. He was wearing Old Spice. What that did was when he walked by and she smelled the Old Spice smell triggered in her memory stored in the lower order brain of years of sexual abuse by her perpetrator who wore, you got it, Old Spice. So that was a trigger. She is now reacting to something in the present as if it was the issue from the past. But this part of your brain has no concept of time. It doesn't understand time. It just feels. So it doesn't know if what I'm feeling in this moment is about that man or about something else, because it doesn't know. It just feels. And when I helped her figure that out there, standing in line, I was able to say to her, is your perpetrator actually here? She says, no. I said, so ma'am, what really happened was when that guy walked by, it just triggered what we call emotional memory. And sadly, it was pain memory for you. And and she's able to calm down because the truth sets you free. That's how it works. You see? That's how it works. When I am early in my marriage, I would, I'm a very affectionate person. Affection is one of my top 10 relational needs. In the top 3, my top 10 relational needs. And I would reach her, hold Luell's hand. But when I would hold her hand, she wasn't very affectionate. She'd pull her hand away. The act of her pulling her hand away triggered an reaction in me. I'd shut down. I'd go and sulk. I'd go into the flight response. All right? I'd shut down, stonewall. Why? Because what I didn't know back in those earlier days was that when she moved her hand, all that was a need for affection. That's not good or bad. That's a human need. But the act of pulling her hand away triggered in me memories of messages that I'm not good enough, that I don't matter, that I don't have value. And that one act triggered in me memories and beliefs that I have around those things. And so then I was reacting to her in the present as if she were those people in the past who sent me those messages. So an emotional trigger really is just, it is a, it's a, it's an intense reaction to some event that's in the present or a stimuli that is similar to something in your past. The problem is that part of your brain has no concept of time and it doesn't think. It just feels. It's a reactive part of the brain. You need that part of your brain if a tiger is coming after you. You need that part of your brain if your spouse has a baseball bat coming after you. Got it? You want this part of your brain. However, in healthy, mature relationships, you've got to learn to regulate that part of your brain when it is triggered. Now, if you're thinking about your own life, think about things that get you triggered. All right? When you don't have control, when you've lost control, when you're not getting your way, when your partner doesn't reach out to you, when your boss doesn't give you the same attention that somebody else gets. All of those create emotional triggers for us. All right. And so what happens is we get into these trigger loops. All right. I call them trigger trouble loops. We get into these trigger trouble loops because this is how the brain works. But it also does this in relationship as well. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here accurately. All right, let me see if I can make this happen. So I have a graph. Whoop, that's not the one I want. I told you, folks, I am learning. All right, so that's not the one that I'm wanting. So we're going to stop sharing there. And I'm going to pull that up. I don't think I know how to do this really well, folks. So let me hit share the screen. Oh, there we go. I found it. I've learned what I was doing wrong. Look at there. All right. There we go. Now, if you can see this couple facing each other. Now, let's take a look at her. You notice there's an emotional trigger. All right. Something happened. All right. He does something. He says something. All right. That creates an emotional reaction in her. All right. She has that emotional, Lori Gordon's terms, allergy. Other people have different names for it. But there's that intense feeling, which shows up, let's go down to the bottom there, as a reactive behavior. Now she's reacting to him. All right. Because typically when we see something, we have an intense reaction, right? We have the emotional trigger, and that emotional reaction has a reactive behavior. So now I am reacting to you. Well, here's how it works in the loop, you see. As I am in this reactive behavior, Luella will see my reactive behavior. She actually sees it. But here's the thing. My reactive behavior actually becomes to Luella a trigger behavior, a trigger event. So she sees my reaction, which is a behavior. As she sees my behavior, my reaction, based on the feeling of whatever it is that happened, that triggers in her emotions, which has a reactive behavior. I see her reaction to me, and her behavior, her reactive behavior to me, is another trigger event for me. So now I now have another reactive behavior, and you can see it's like a circle. As I get triggered, she gets triggered, and then as she's triggered, I get triggered, which triggers her, which triggers me, and you're off into this cycle. It's a crazy cycle, some people call it. All right, a lot of therapists have names for this. But here's what most people don't understand. Whenever you see something happen and your brain has that emotional, right, whatever it is, fight, flight, or freeze, which has a behavior to it, people think that the reactive behavior from the emotions of whatever happened, believe that the event itself is the reason I have the feeling and the reactive behavior, which triggers you and your stuff, which triggers me, and it's just, kind of back and forth. It's like a big loop. But that actually isn't true. What actually is true is this. You'll notice in between the emotional trigger and the reactive behavior is something. It's called thoughts and feelings about the trigger event. Thoughts and feelings about the trigger event. In other words, folks, it's not the event itself that creates the emotional triggers, which has a reactive behavior, which then triggers Luella, which has a reactive behavior, which then triggers me and my reactive behavior. It's actually my thoughts and my feelings about the event. Remember I said earlier that the lower part of the brain has no concept of time. It doesn't know. It just reacts. It's just a feeling. It's a feeling. But what you don't know is that behind that feeling and that reactive behavior, you actually have thoughts and feelings about what they did. And it's the thoughts and feelings about the event that actually creates the reactive behavior. Let me give you an example of the loop. Excuse me. Let's say that Luella raises her voice. That's the behavior, all right? She raises her voice in frustration. So as she raises her voice in frustration, that triggers in me an emotion. I get an emotional trigger. I get emotionally aroused, which then leads to a reactive behavior. I shut down and go silent. And as I shut down and go silent, she sees that. So what does she do? She starts to pursue more. So she starts to talk louder. And as she starts to talk louder, I shut down more. So here is how it really works. You ready? Luella raises her voice to me in anger or frustration, which triggers in me an emotion, the fight, flight, or freeze mind. It's instantaneous. 1-2,000. You get that, right? Typically, though, we go straight to the reactive behavior. That's instantaneous. Remember what I said? In between the actual emotional reaction and the behavior are thoughts and feelings about what happened. Now let's give it to you the accurate way. Luella raises her voice to me in frustration. So I have this reaction based on my beliefs that when people raise their voice to you, my past learnings is that when people raise their voice, somebody is about to get hurt, which creates feelings of fear and insecurity in me. And that leads to me shutting down and not talking. And when I shut down and don't talk, she sees that, which triggers in her an emotional reaction based on her beliefs and past learnings that when people shut down and talk, you might be getting abandoned, which creates feelings of anger in her. So she talks louder in order to get my attention, which then triggers in me believes that when people start to talk louder, somebody is about to get hurt. So I shut down more and go to the next room, which triggers in her that when people walk away from you, you're really about to get abandoned, which creates more anger, but now fear that she's about to be rejected. So then, what does she do? She pursues me. And when I see her pursuing me, that triggers in me a reaction, because I believe, based on my past learnings, that when people pursue you, you know you're about to get hurt because there'll be no reason for them to pursue you. And that creates fear. So I go outside to get away, which then triggers in her not anger, but an emotional reaction that when people walk away from you like that, you are about to be abandoned. And now she's afraid. So she follows me outside, pleading with me to stay, which triggers in me that when people do that, they're manipulating you because they're still trying to control you. You get it? It's this crazy cycle. It's a crazy cycle. It creates craziness for both of you. But all of it is based on our own construction, based on our own histories and our own understanding of what happened in the past. But we have no conscious idea that what's actually taking place in the present isn't about our partner. It's about our history. This is why we say and relate well, you need to learn to communicate accurately and well. And you've got to learn to emotionally regulate. That is about maturity. You've got to be able to use the higher order brain to regulate the lower order brain so that you can stay present to yourself and others. When you operate out of the lower reptile brain there, you're not present to yourself and you're not present to others. You're not present to the relationship, the idea of us. And so the greatest gift you actually give yourself is the gift of being present. But to do that, you've got to be able to emotionally regulate that lower order animal brain. Sadly, most people are never taught how to regulate that part of your brain. Again, like I said earlier, you want that part of your brain working and being chased by a lion, 18-wheeler coming at you, things like that. But in intimate relationships, you've got to learn to regulate that part of your brain so that you can stay in the higher order brain, which is where compassion flows from, by the way. And compassion is the way you do this, all right? You got to move to compassion. But to move to compassion, you're going to have to go to a higher order brain. See, the lower brain is self-protective. It's all about me. The higher order brain, I can take a deep breath. That's one of the ways you can access the higher order brain when you're in this crazy cycle. Is why don't you just take a deep breath? Because whenever you're in that lower part of your brain, your heart races. It's meant to. Fight, flight, or freeze, right? Right? But if you start to regulate your breathing, you'll regulate your heart. And when you regulate your heart and slow your heart rate down, you can access the higher order brain and start to think and be present. Excuse me. I really wish I didn't have this cough. I appreciate your patience with me, though. And once we can learn to regulate that lower order emotional brain, then we can begin to say, you know, when I did this, how did you see that? Help me understand what it was like for you when I did that. What did your brain tell you when this happened? You can now begin to listen and ask questions about what did their brain see? What did their brain interpret? What is their brain telling them? When I did that, what did your brain tell me about me? You don't love me. Wow. So when I did that, your brain said, I don't love you. Yes. Where did you learn that? Help me understand it. I get to understand their perspective. And that creates compassion on my part. And then they can. You know what the real key is to shut this whole crazy cycle off? It's one word. It's confiding. Whenever you confide, that requires vulnerability. So the way you shut the loop off is basic, simple. someone takes a risk and confide. Confide what? Confide what's going on inside of them. This is why in Relate Well, we have the express skill and a reveal skill. Both of those are problem revealing. They're both problem understanding skills. It allows me to confide in you what's going on inside of me. And because I'm not in a reactive behavior, I use a skill which requires confiding. I'm not in a reactive behavior. I'm confiding to vulnerability. You see the vulnerability. You see the emotional openness in me. That doesn't create a negative reaction to you. That actually creates compassion and empathy in the listener. So I'm not in a reactive behavior because I chose to use a skill and open up, confide in you. And then you're not seeing a reactive behavior in me. So you're not being triggered. You actually moved empathy, and I see the empathy. What does your empathy say to me? Wow, it means you love me. You care about me. It means my thoughts and feelings are important. You shut the loops off, these crazy cycle loops. You shut them off purely by confiding. And either of you can do it because it's a cycle. Either of you can confide and shut this whole thing off. And at the end of it, you created something more loving. At the end of it, you've created something meaningful. At the end of it, your usness is intact. Your relationship has been protected and preserved. You see, these crazy cycles, Lori Gordon referred to them as emotional allergy infinity loops. People have different names for it. A lot of people write about these crazy cycles. The trigger trouble loops. That's what I call them. But here's the thing about them. They can go on and on and on and on and on. Week after week, month after month, and they can go on for years. And you never shut them down. And it's all from this lower order brain interpreting what's happening out here from meaning things in the past. You need to be able to understand that the brain makes assumptions about everything. It tries to interpret everything that happens, that it experiences. But the interpretations, the meaning that your brain attaches to things that happen, those meanings come from your past. And it may not be true right out here, right here, right now, in this moment. This is why healthy, mature people, when they're when they're emotionally triggered, they're aware that they're triggered. One of the things that I had to do in my own personal development is be aware, self-aware of when I got triggered at that emotional level. And my way of doing things when I'm triggered is to take a deep breath because I want to regulate my heart. I take a deep breath and I can feel myself access the higher order brain. And once I access that higher order brain, I can say, help me understand. What does this mean for you? When this happened, what did your brain tell you? I become a student. And I learn their perspective. Just by doing that, I shut the whole loop off. See, anybody can shut the trigger trouble loop off. The crazy cycle, as Gary Smalley calls it, John Trent, different names for different people. Because it's a circle, it's just a circle that keeps going on and on and on. Either you can shut it down and create a new way of being. In the field of marriage therapy, the field of marriage therapy is built off what's known as systems theory. I won't bore you with all the facts around it, but the idea is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. All right. And so when you live for the whole, what I call us, you begin to realize that the whole is far more meaningful. All right. And the parts have greater meaning and value in the context of the whole. In the context of when the whole is healthy and strong, you see. And so all all systems, be it biological systems or relational systems, seek a steady state. All right. This is why some people stay in crazy cycles for so long, because the crazy cycle is the steady state. It's what's called homeostasis in the systems theory world. Right. Really good book by Napoleon Hill. Those who are in the personal development world. He wrote a book in 1930 called Outwitting the Devil. It's not a Christian book, but it is highly powerful in understanding why people never become successful and stay in dysfunctional patterns. Hill's term for homeostasis way back in early 30s, he called it harmonic rhythm, that there's a rhythm to life. Just as much as a spring, there's going to be a summer and a fall and a winter. That's harmonic rhythm. That's homeostasis. The problem is, I yell, you withdraw, I yell more. That's a rhythm. And a lot of these rhythms are dysfunctional, but they feel normal. They're familiar. They're comfortable. Or like people like to say, well, that's the way we've always done it. Might be, but it's pretty dysfunctional, pretty unhealthy, and pretty immature. So the real key is to change the dysfunctional pattern to a healthier pattern and make that the new norm. You make that the new norm. That's going to take time, intentionality, but eventually it becomes a habit, just a new way. This is why my work over the years in my own transformation, my own journey of healing, was I intentionally used the skills and tools I learned. Why? Because I wanted to change my old way of being to a new way of being, so it just became a pattern for me. And this is the power of living life apart from your triggers and not allowing your emotional triggers to dictate your present, but to be able to step back from those things, get a sense of where they came from, own my own triggers, so I don't allow my trigger issues from my past and history to destroy us, the relation, the marriage itself. And that requires maturity, by the way. And so our work in Relate Well really is about living life out of 4 words. We've trademarked this. We call this the 4 protectors. And we take this everywhere. We take it into business everywhere. I've been teaching on this for about, almost 20 years, but very intentional the last 13. Our Relate Well program is built around these 4 words, that in all aspects of your life, if you want to protect your relationships, live a life of goodwill, live a life of respect, live a life of humility, and live a life of empathy, care. And if I become a person of goodwill, respect, humility, and empathy, then I know for a fact that I'm loving and caring. Because loving people always treat others with goodwill, respect, empathy. You can't do those 3 things without humility. It's a very powerful way to live your life. And so, in conclusion, wrapping this up, when you notice you're in a trigger, take a time out, get away, take a deep breath. All right. Oh, by the way, when you take a time out, we have a rule for timeout and Relate Well. Don't just walk away. Let them know you're why. So listen, I need some time to calm down. Forgive me, COVID cough. Let them know why you're walking away. So I just need some time to calm down. I'll be back in an hour. All right. Take a time out if you need to. Do some deep breathing. Self-soothe. Gottman's research talks about the power of being able to self-soothe. Lower your heart rate. Access the higher order brain. And then what we say in our world, go get your Relate Well skills and use those and create a new way of being without the negativity of the old trigger loop. You create a new loop, a loving loop, a mature loop, a loop of relating well to each other, a loop of goodwill and respect. Hopefully, this has been helpful for you. If you need help, look us up at relatewell.us or drrickmarks.com. Take care.